So the nature of science really defies one single description. For a lot of time now, scientists have described the scientific method. However, this implies that there's a single way of doing science, and that's simply not the case. At its core, science is aimed at understanding the natural world through observation and reasoning. And in all truth, it just begins with observation. So much of science is purely descriptive. For example, we've been spending a lot of effort trying to classify all the life on Earth. And in the 21st century, we've spent a lot of effort on sequencing genomes. The human genome sequencing is complete. From these two descriptive portions of science, we're now able to present many more hypotheses and ask more questions and clarify and go to deeper levels of our understanding of science. Science uses both deductive and inductive reasoning. This is based on the study of logic. They're basically two opposite ways of arriving at logical conclusions. Science makes use of both of these methods, although the induction method is the primary way of reasoning in the hypothesis-driven science. Deductive reasoning uses general principles to make specific predictions. For example, when we think about more than 2,000 years ago, the Greek scientist Eratosthenes, he used Euclidean geometry and deductive reasoning to accurately estimate the circumference of the Earth. Deductive reasoning is the reasoning of mathematics and philosophy, and it's used to test the validity of general ideas in all branches of knowledge. Here you can see Eratosthenes' work. When sunlight shone down the well in this location here, he knew that the distance between here and here was about 800 kilometers. And so by measuring the shadow laid down by an obelisk, he was able to predict by using the principles of Euclidean geometry, noting that angle A would be equal to angle A over here. Knowing that these two angles were congruent and knowing this distance was about 800 kilometers, he was able to predict that this was 1/50th of the circumference of the Earth. He multiplied it by 50 times and came up with very close to the actual circumference of the Earth. Another example of deductive reasoning is if we define all mammals by having hair, and you find an animal that doesn't have hair, you might conclude that it's not a mammal. Biologists use deductive reasoning to infer that a particular specimen belongs to a particular species. With inductive reasoning, logic flows in the opposite direction, from the specific to the general. So we use these specific observations to develop general conclusions. For example, if we have dogs that have hair, like poodles or Labradors, and every dog that you observe has hair, then you might conclude that all dogs have hair. That's from the specific to the general. Inductive reasoning leads to generalizations that can be tested. Inductive reasoning first became important to scientists in the 1600s in Europe when we started seeing Francis Bacon and Isaac Newton and others begin to use the results of many different experiments to infer general principles about physics and how the world operates as we understand it today. This is the world of Newtonian physics. Now, paradigms change, of course. As we learn more and more information, what we know of our universe changes. For example, now we're moving more into an Einsteinian view of physics. A modern example from biology of inductive reasoning is that we found these genes called homeobox genes. They were involved in the development of fruit flies. And it was found that if we interfered with these genes, we could cause dramatic changes in development, such as a leg appearing in the place of an antenna, or an antenna appearing in the place of a leg. When we isolated these genes and sequenced them, we found that they are not only in fruit flies, but these very similar homeobox genes were found in many animals, including humans. This led to the general idea that homeobox genes act as switches to control developmental rates. In hypothesis-driven science, scientists establish which general principles are true from among the many that might be true, using a systematic process of testing all these alternative proposals. If the proposals prove inconsistent with the observations, then they're going to be rejected. So scientists use a systematic approach to gain an understanding of their natural world. We may make an observation about the world. For example, my car does not start. The question might then be, why does my car not start? We might have several different hypotheses. Think now about possible hypotheses of why your car might not start. The battery could be dead. We could be out of gas. The starter could be gone. And naturally, we test each of these hypotheses using an experiment in order to either reject the hypothesis and begin with another, or accept that hypothesis. So what would an appropriate experiment be for the hypothesis that our battery is dead? There are a number of different experiments you could perform. First, you might say, well, do any of the dash lights come on? Or maybe you swap out the battery. Seems like a more complex way to go, but it's an experiment nonetheless. Eventually, through a number of different possible hypotheses, we make a prediction, and we complete many experiments in order to confirm those predictions. So we use an observation, hypothesis, prediction, experimentation, and then we can draw some conclusions about the situation. A hypothesis is a possible explanation for the observation. So in the example of our car, there are many possible explanations for why the car won't start. Now, you have to think of it as a falsifiable hypothesis. So I might go out to my car and say metaphysically, it doesn't start today because, well, I'm just not supposed to go to school today and work is just not in the stars for me today. And that is not a falsifiable explanation. So a hypothesis must be falsifiable. I can test whether my battery has any power. I can test whether the starter works. I can test whether there's gas or not. So all of these are scientific explanations as opposed to metaphysical explanations. Not that any metaphysical explanation is wrong per se, but in order for us to use an explanation in science, it must be falsifiable. In order to falsify it, we have to test it. And it's often tested in many different ways. For example, with the battery, we can check the ignition lights. We can put a battery tester on the battery. Or we could just swap out the battery for one that we know works. Hypotheses are iterative. That means they can be changed and refined with new data. So we use the predictions and we test the hypothesis. If the prediction is confirmed, then we're good to go. We've supported the hypothesis. However, if our predictions are not confirmed by the experiments, then we will refine the hypothesis and go through the whole process again. Experiments are used to test the hypothesis. They have to be carefully designed to test for only one variable at a time. So in the example of our car starting, we need to control for all the other variables. Or let's look at another example. If we're testing to see whether Wheaties have an effect on someone's mile time when they're running on the track, then we need to control for everything except the use of Wheaties. In this sense, we have a test experiment and a control experiment, or a test group and a control group. One group we feed the Wheaties. The other group we don't feed Wheaties, but they still run the mile around the track on the same day, and we have a representative group of people that are of the same stature and weight and sex and fitness level in order to test the validity that Wheaties would increase our mile time. Now, if both of our groups were significantly different in, say, their body weight and their fitness level, then we can't accurately determine whether the Wheaties were responsible for the people's increased mile times. Hypotheses should make predictions, and the predictions provide a way to test the validity of the hypotheses. Hypotheses must be rejected if the experiment produces results inconsistent with the predictions. That is, it has to be falsifiable, and if the results are inconsistent, then we throw it out and start with a new hypothesis or modify our hypothesis. The more experimentally supported predictions a hypothesis makes, the more valid the hypothesis is. Scientists often use the philosophical approach of reductionism to understand complex systems by reducing things to their working parts. Reductionism is the basis of biochemistry, where we've been enormously successful at unraveling the complexity of cellular metabolism by concentrating on individual pathways and specific enzymes. By looking at all of these different pathways together, we're able to see the overall picture of the metabolism of cells. Reductionism has its problems, though. As we explored before, when we put pieces together into their whole, then we see there are emergent properties. That is, the whole is much greater than the sum of its parts. For example, by looking at a specific enzyme in isolation, we may see that it behaves in a particular way. However, it does not behave exactly in the same way when it's interacting with other enzymes, and the pH that it's exposed to will change how it acts, and so on and so forth. So that brings us into systems biology, where we're beginning to focus on the emergent properties that cannot be understood by looking at the simpler parts. It's important that we consider both of these philosophical approaches in order to really understand the nature of what's going on in biology. We often use models in biological science. Modeling is a way to organize our thoughts about how the system as a whole might work. We take the parts that are provided by a reductionist approach and fit them together, and the model shows how they might function once we fit them all together. It also suggests experiments that can be used to test our model in order to understand the nature of the system's functioning. I'd like for you to take a moment here to think about what theory means to you. Because in science, it has a much different connotation than it does outside of the world of science. There are two different ways to think about a theory in science. The first meaning of a theory is it's a proposed explanation for some natural phenomenon. For example, Newton's theory of gravity. Another meaning for theory is that it's a body of interconnective concepts, and it's supported by a vast amount of experimental evidence and scientific reasoning. Scientific theory expresses ideas of which we are absolutely most certain. It's not just a term we throw around there. After much hypothesizing and experimentation and support, we come up with a theory. So Newton's theory of gravity fits this explanation. We are pretty sure that gravity exists, just as much as we have a theory of evolution. The theory of evolution has such a huge volume of supporting evidence behind it that we are as certain as we possibly could be. In general, though, the meaning of theory implies a lack of knowledge. For example, I have a theory about what she's up to. We really have no idea. So keep in mind that the scientific definition of theory means it's virtually fact. But in science, there are no facts because we always maintain an open state of mind for our theories to be changed as we learn more and more about the world around us through our scientific experimentation. This is in great contrast to the common meaning of theory outside of science, where we really have no idea what she might be up to. Just something to think about. Okay, so let's check in on how we're doing so far with a quick color card quiz. Again, remember, just write down on your paper the color of the choice that you think is correct, and we'll check in with them shortly. The application of specific observations to predict a general result is an example of deductive reasoning. Red, this is true, or green, this is false. In science, a hypothesis can be proven true. Red, this is false. Green, this is true. A researcher predicts that chemical X will make plants grow taller and designs an experiment to test the prediction. This prediction can be classified as red, an observation, yellow, a hypothesis, blue, a conclusion, or green, a theory. If aliens have green pointed ears and I do not, then I am not an alien. Red, this is deductive reasoning. Blue, this is inductive reasoning. Here you go. Check your answers. It went green, red, yellow, red. If you have something different than that, then go back and review. Make sure that you understand these concepts before moving on to the next section of this lecture.